Hey, Sam, turn that down.
Good evening, Penn Staters, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association, and I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's virtual speaker session, which is being recorded. The recording can be found along with our listing of events and other resources for alumni at alumni.psu.edu. Tonight, PSAA presents Ben Feller, an alumni fellow, an award-winning journalist, and a communications advisor, and he will offer his thoughts on COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're currently enduring, what life is like in New York City, the political implications in a presidential election year, and what people can do to prepare for what's next. This evening's discussion is the latest installment in a recurring series of virtual programming. And again, you can find the full list of our virtual programs at alumni.psu.edu/events. We have the right person for tonight's discussion. I'm happy to welcome Ben Feller. Ben is a partner at Mercury, which is a global strategy firm where he advises companies and organizations and really specializes on crafting powerful messaging. He came to Mercury in 2013 after a 20-year career in which he distinguished himself as one of the finest reporters in the nation. Ben served as the chief White House correspondent for the Associated Press, the largest news organization in the world. Ben covered President Barack Obama and George W. Bush and traveled aboard Air Force One to more than 25 countries. Ben also happens to hail here from Center County in Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, and is a proud Penn Stater. Ben has a unique perspective on politics in our times and on the pandemic and how it's altered American life. He's led questioning of presidents from the White House briefing room, and now he advises his clients on how to communicate in challenging times and make sense of the world around them. So Ben, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Paul, thanks so much for having me. How you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. You know, tonight we're going to talk about politics. We'll talk about the media. We'll definitely talk about Penn State, and we might even sprinkle a little baseball into the conversation. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Let's do it.
Yeah, a lot we want to get to. So Ben, first tell us, how did you become a Penn Stater? What was your path from Boalsburg to the White House and to what you're doing today?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, as we speak tonight, I have this big sense of place going through my mind because I'm here in New York City, and they just wrapped up the 7 p.m., clanging of the bells outside to honor emergency workers. So I'm always reminded that I live here. But I grew up, as you said, in Boalsburg, a place small enough to call itself a village. And my path to Penn State really began from my first days. That's my hometown. I think about it in terms of my sense of community, my friends, and my family. So I grew up there and lived in New York for a little while in high school, but I was always in the back of my mind to come back to Penn State as a student, which I did, and eventually became a journalism major. And after that, really my professional career is sort of in two pieces, if you will, Paul. The first 20 were in journalism. I happened to be in reporting for an even 20 years, and I just moved from one newspaper to another. The first was there in Center County, the Center Daily Times, and I covered high school basketball and the start of hunting season and every single weather story that seemed to happen, and
Right.
the big battles at the college township zoning board. And then when I got promoted to county government, which was a big deal, the meetings were held at the Willowbank building, which happened to be the place where I was born. So it was always a reminder that I was working at home. And then as I moved up to North Carolina and Florida, about 10 years in, I became a national reporter for the Associated Press in DC. And that was a big leap for me, covering education issues. And during that time, President Bush was in office, and he gave an education speech that they let me cover. And I was my first trip on Air Force One. Nothing went wrong. I made the plane on time. I didn't oversleep. Everything was fine. And so the AP began to have trust in me. And then when I was ready to do something different, they put me on the White House beat. And so I covered the last 2 years of President Bush and the first 4 years of President Obama. And we had some changes at the AP during that time. And so I continued to move up, and eventually I became the chief correspondent there. And that was a game changer, right? It was 6 years on that beat. Yeah. And, everything. I was flying into war zones in Afghanistan, covering the Great Recession, Supreme Court nominations, and pretty much everything you could think of. Everything really goes through the White House at some level. And so that was the first piece. And then the second piece started, as you said, in 2013, and moved to New York and knew I was ready for something different. And I landed as an entrepreneur and went into business at this firm, Mercury, where basically my job is to help people solve problems. I provide communication counsel and strategic counsel, and take everything I learned as a reporter about how the world works and the right questions to ask, and try to help from inside the room. I spent a lot of years banging on the door to get in the room to figure out what's going on. And now I'm inside the room and helping people from the inside try to think through decisions. And so it was a really interesting challenge to kind of bet on myself and try something new. And it's been 7 years, and, so far so good, still grinding away to be continued, but I'm happy with it.
Absolutely. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about Penn State and your Penn State experience. Was there an experience, a course, a professor at Penn State that is top of mind for you, that has made a lasting impact into the professional that you've become? Well,
there are definitely professors that come to mind. It's the accumulation of it, Paul. When I was there, I was in one mode of semester to semester, trying to do really well in classes and having a hell of a lot of fun. And then that kind of got me through my junior year, and I studied abroad in Exeter in England and had a very eye-opening experience there. Really my first time outside of, upstate New York and central Pennsylvania. And I came back from that and as a senior, and I thought, I better figure out what the hell I'm going to do with the rest of my life, because college is going to be over soon. And Penn State kind of created that opportunity for me. And then when I decided to try journalism and go a different way in the senior year, it took me a little bit longer, but I was a very determined student at that point to kind of go into the work world with a set of skills that were going to have me gainfully employed. And so I sort of had a before and after, right? The first few years. And then when I became a journalism major, competing really to get into classes with freshmen, and I went through the weed out classes, that part of my life was really formative. And going to those classes with a sense of purpose. I was a string correspondent for the Center Daily Times during that period. And so I think when I left, I was a much more prepared, but also much more mature. And then Penn State really allowed me to do that.
Yeah, psychology major for 3 years, you study abroad, and then it's rare that someone comes back from a study abroad experience and then changes their major, especially one that happens their junior year. What was it that drew you towards journalism?
Well, I had not really focused on what I enjoyed. I was focusing on it from a very practical perspective of what classes do I need to take and what am I gaining from them? But there was no bigger picture. And I think getting a sense of the world brought that to me. And then I thought, I'm not really enjoying psychology. I don't really see the path here. I can do it, but then I'm going to finish college and not have that sense of direction. And there was both a desire there, but also I'm sure a fear to figure that out at that point in my college career. And the list of things that I really was thinking about that would make me happy was pretty short at that point. I liked writing. I liked telling stories. I liked the idea of being on the front lines. There was a real appeal to that for me, a real spirit to that. And so journalism was a natural, and it was also the path where I wasn't going to have to spend another 4 years, at least some of my credits transferred. And I gave it a shot, and that really paid off, because once I started seeing my name in print and understanding that I could figure this out with a lot of support from both professors and my first editors at the local paper, then you start to build a confidence and get into a flow, and that was really fun.
So talk a little bit about when the intersection occurred for you then between journalism and what seems to be the through line throughout your career around writing about public policy and writing about politics.
Yeah, well, at first, as you're a young journalist, you take what you can get. I mean, you take the beats that are available to you. It so happened when I started that it was back during a time when local government was more appreciated as a cornerstone of journalism. And so that was what all the reporters that at that time were really going through and starting with. And so that was my grounding. As I moved up to bigger papers, the level of politics got more sophisticated and more tricky and more backbiting. And of course, the policy decisions got more sophisticated too. And I think as the stakes got higher, that's what I liked. What the politics are always interesting, and the characters and personalities, but understanding that you're the one that gets to dive in and explain what's happening without any varnish to the whole audience. I like that a lot. And that's became a natural, both education, policy, politics. And it got me to Washington, where I just thrived. I loved being in the center of everything from the White House to Congress, the education department. And that was basically my proving ground to get to the White House. But it was all sort of step by step. I never found covering hard news, covering politics or policy to be dry. There was some real impact and human emotion to those stories too. But a lot of competitors didn't see it that way, right? So if you have the right mindset about those things and you're willing to work really hard, then you're setting yourself up for success. And I just kept writing that.
As I was reading some of your work that you'd previously done, you actually just articulated something that I was trying to put my finger on. It's you had the ability, whether it was in Greensboro or in your time at Tampa, to kind of take national and international stories and tell them with a local angle on it. And one that really jumped out at me was, as Americans, as a journalist, I'm sure everyone remembers where we were on September 11th, 2001.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the stories. You were in Tampa at the time. Talk a little bit about the stories that you were covering, and how you kind of covered this international story, and thing that was going on, but from local angles.
Yeah, the thing that was always on my mind with any story, but particularly one like that, is the mindset of the audience. In other words, the goal isn't to figure out what your assignment is and to go report it and write it the best you can and move on. There's another level there of understanding why people should care. And that worked its way into my stories a lot. And obviously, the more obscure the topic, the harder it is to do that. But with 9/11 and that whole period, it was, how do you make sense of this for people? And how do you take something with that kind of gravity that seemed to be playing out, in the financial and political capital of the world, but was really playing out in everybody's homes, right? That unnerving sense that we had been invaded and that nothing was going to be the same again. And how do you find the people in that community who are helping, who are struggling, who may have lost somebody? There were local angles to that every day, and you had to find them. And it really ties into the work I do now and what we're living through in the pandemic. Is everybody's thinking about this big macro story that affects the US and affects the world. But that's not how people are living the story. They're living it in a very individualized way. And that's how you have to communicate.
Yeah, it was interesting. The story that jumped out at me. I mean, you were on the higher education desk at the time. And I was just, it jumped out to me that you found a way, and really actually, you were able to break news in higher education around something going on at the University of South Florida, where a professor had found themselves intertwined in the terrorism plot. Talk a little bit about that specific story.
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been so many stories since then that one didn't immediately jump to mind when you said 9/11, but it was a huge story. And that's partly a matter of serendipity, right? I was in Tampa covering higher education across the state. The school in Tampa, a public university called the University of South Florida, even though it's not in South Florida, had a professor who had been previously associated with terrorist links and had been reviewed, and nothing came of it. When 9/11 happened, he gave an interview to the O'Reilly Factor that caused just shudders through the campus, because it brought back to the fore this idea that this professor was somehow linked to terrorism. And for the next year plus, the school in Tampa became the case study of academic freedom for the entire country. And so that was a case where you didn't so much have to look to localize the story, because in fact it was a national story. And I covered that for a very long time. And when the university president decided to make her decision, she came to me for a very tricky story to cover. But I remembered that day very well, because I was at the Tampa Tribune, which no longer exists. We were competing against the St. Petersburg Times, which called itself the best newspaper in Florida. But on that day, we were better, and I loved it. Don't ever get me wrong. It's about telling the story and reaching people. But if you don't have a competitive streak to you in communications, especially on a story like that, you're not going to make it very far on most days. And so everything came together there. And look, that story got me to Washington along with some others. And then the way I covered education in Washington got me to the White House. I remember an editor saying, "You cover education like it's City Hall, like it's Congress. There's a hard news to everything you do." And I thought, well, that's happening, right? That's how it should be covered.
Yeah, talk a little bit about, you mentioned competition, and you mentioned that was among the stories that got you to Washington. But talk about the competition to ultimately become the AP's White House correspondent. I would imagine that there were other AP reporters that covered policy areas that were also in the running for that. So some of our listeners today are current students or just recent graduates.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about your mindset. Was your eye on the prize to be the White House correspondent, or talk about your mindset and how you got there?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because my eye was absolutely not on that prize. My eyes were on the story that I had to cover every day. And I've spoken about this before, but to me, that was my path to success, is that if you continuously put care and attention into the craft of writing and have a tremendous competitive spirit where basically there's nothing an editor can say that will light a fire under you more than you've done for yourself, that's going to pay off. And at that point, by the time I got to Washington, I had seen that play out. It doesn't always work out in a particularly fair or linear way, of course, but overall, that was how I saw it. And so when I covered education for 4 years, at that point, I was feeling a little bit like I was covering the same thing over again, which is never a good feeling. So I went in and talked to the bureau chief, Sandy Johnson at the time. And she's like, yeah, you've been here 2 years. I'm like, actually, it's 4. And she looked up, it's like, no, it hasn't. I'm like, yeah, it has been 4 years. You might not have been counting, but I have. And so she thought about it. And again, I had had a couple of trips on Air Force One. I made mention of the education speech, but there was another one where President Bush took what was supposed to be an innocuous trip to Denver to talk about energy. And there was an enormous controversy playing back in Washington during his trip, where he ended up battling with his own party, which was very uncommon. And he was so irate about it that he had a news conference on Air Force One on the way back. And they just had an aide come back to the back of the plane. And he said, you, and you, come with me. And I had no idea where the hell I was going. But I remember walking up to, what ended up being the president's conference room. The guy from the Washington Post, who didn't know my name, nobody really knew my name, said, hey, man. I said, what? He's like, can I have some paper? I'm like, okay, well, I'm more prepared than you because I have paper at least, So we went in and the President Bush went around the room and said hi to everybody. And he looked at me and said, don't know you, which was, I just pressed record on my recorder. And I said, I'm Ben Feller from the AP. He's like, oh, AP, okay, come on, sit up front. AP likes to sit up front. Come on up here. And, that story was a big story that day. And I think my boss just said, okay, he wasn't trying to get on the White House beat, but if we want him there, if things go sideways, he'll be ready. That's really what it was. It was just building up the trust. And boy, when I got to the White House beat, I was starting all over again. I mean, they might have thought I was ready, but I did not feel I was ready. And I just read and prepared and didn't sleep very much. And the cycle started all over again, and that's the thing, Paul, is that you never really master it.
Yeah.
There's always somebody else chasing something down. And the expectations are so high. So it keeps you moving even on the days when you don't feel like you have it because somebody else is going to get there.
Have you ever felt ready?
I felt relief after the fact that, wow, I really was. When I was looking back at some stories, and tomorrow I think is the day. I just happened to find this. I was assigned to cover the news and the announcement and break the story of who President Obama's first Supreme Court nominee was going to be, which is widely known, at least it was then, I think it still is, as one of the hardest stories to break in Washington. It's so closely held, and there are so many people going after it in so many ways that story can come out. It's hard to lay down every trap. And so I remember, 19 days of doing nothing else but living that. It was Memorial Day weekend, 2009, I think. And it could have happened over Memorial Day. And so I remember hearing people like splashing in the pool and like, I cannot leave. And I got a heads up to come into the White House very early the next morning. And I broke that story by a few minutes. And so I didn't feel I was ready until I had it. And then when I had it, it felt great. I'm like, okay, I guess I was, Yeah. And so I don't want to overplay that. Like there's only so much you can do. And I got to that stage, but part of you is always, I think, thinking about it.
Yeah, I asked that question because I get a lot of times I hear either from a student or from a recent graduate that I keep in touch with, or even a peer in my industry.
Yeah.
This job has come open, but I don't think I'm ready. And my response to them has always been, if you wait till you're ready, then you'll be waiting forever. I mean, part of being ready is being ready to take the risk to try something that you don't know if you're ready to do or not. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, there's a real value in reaching. Yeah. And I remember when I got the assignment to go from education to the White House and all the pressure I felt from that, I was taking a chance on myself and they were taking a chance on me. And my first story was to cover a trip of Vice President Cheney to Wyoming to stump. This was during the midterms of 2006. and I was calling around for some reaction to what he said, and I called the Democratic Congressional Committee, and the spokesperson, I introduced myself and said, "Hey, I'm probably going to be calling you now and then. I just moved over to the White House beat from education," and she said, "Geez, that's a pretty big leap." And I remember her suggestion that I wasn't ready made me angry, because I'm like, actually not. I'm supposed to be here. So I thought sort of like it's okay to do it to yourself, to keep checking.
Right.
But I remember feeling when she said that, I'm like, no, I am ready.
You bring up Dick Cheney. There's some interesting stories about Dick Cheney's visit to State College and a fly fishing trip that he took here on a commencement trip. Apparently, he found himself fly fishing with one of the great professors here at Penn State, and they couldn't get him out of the river. I mean, not physically, but he didn't want to stop fishing. And so folklore has it that he actually gave the commencement speech with his hip waders still on underneath his gown. So
that's pretty funny. Well, I wasn't on that trip, but I was on President Obama's trip to State College, and the memory of taking the Air Force One, the junior version of it, into the University Park airport, and so we're in the motorcade in Wire One, as they call it, with a small pool of other reporters. And I was narrating the hell out of this. I'm like, I used to go there as a kid, and then we got down to Park Avenue or Park Road. And I was like, well, that was my dorm. I'll tell you, man, nobody cared. They
Right.
just did not give a damn at all about my story. Eventually, they stopped telling State College stories.
Yeah. All right. So let's dive into your time at the White House. You covered the White House, like we've talked about, under Bush and Obama.
Mm-hmm.
You were in the room with Tony Snow, Dana Perino, Robert Gibbs, Jay Carney. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the reporter and the press secretary?
Yeah, I mean, the most important takeaway for me is that, both to your question and a lot of things in the White House, it's not like there's this monolithic relationship. The relationship between the press and the president, or the what is the White House press corps thinking? Like, those kind of catchphrases don't capture the fact that these are all individuals who have different interests and different expectations, different deadlines, different work ethics. And so my relationship to those four press secretaries was different. I didn't know Tony that well before he ultimately got sick and died. Very sad story, but he was well respected. Dana was somebody who I knew in a previous job, and we had some battles together, but also worked closely together on stories. And then when Obama won, I had been at the White House, so I wasn't on the Obama campaign. So that was an interesting dynamic, because some people came off the campaign and were new to the White House, and some were at the White House. And so really, Gibbs and that campaign were new, and I had been there, but of course, I didn't have the relationship with them. So I formed a good one with him, I thought. And then Carney came in and was very different than Robert Gibbs in terms of how he saw the role. He was much more focused on the briefing than Gibbs was. And I never really, I had the job as the AP correspondent of leading those briefings, meaning I would ask the first question, and it was
Right.
It was up to me to really end the briefing too by saying thank you, which was everybody's permission to leave. But I didn't get tremendous value out of those as the years went on. I was much more focused on interviews up in people's offices and wherever I could catch them. And so Gibbs and Carney were different that way. And then after I left, Josh Earnest replaced Jay Carney, and I'm still in touch with Josh. And so, listen, the goals are the same. Is I'm trying to find out as much as I can, as fast as I can, to get it out before anyone else. But your relationships matter. And we would always push for access and trust, and it varied by the press secretary. But now all of that was before, of course, how things are now, where
Right.
it's a whole new world. But I thought that I took that relationship really seriously. And ultimately, if you couldn't get what you needed, you got to build other sources. There's lots of different ways to find out what's happening.
Yeah, I actually watched, if you could believe this, I watched some C-SPAN videos of briefings that you participated in. And I was looking for the kind of interactions that have become all too common on on TV today, and really couldn't find any that approached the level of discourse that we see on TV today. What has changed in your opinion?
Well, I mean, for starters, first of all, those moments that you're referring to, they did happen in the briefing rooms that I worked in. Again, it also goes to the personality of the reporter. So I was very focused on, both with the press secretaries and the presidents, a construction that was, you said you were going to do A, you've ended up doing B, how do you explain yourself? Like I was very much in the mode of trying to pin them down on accountability and flip-flops and look ahead. Other reporters had much different styles, and I'm not saying it was worse or better, but that they were a little bit more made for sort of those TV moments. Now, we have a president whose first press secretary, Sean Spicer, on the day of the inauguration came in and blistered the press over, saying that, complaining about the crowd size at the inauguration, and said things that he admits that now were provably false, and regrets that he went out and did that. So that the relationship on the very first day of this presidency was really tainted. And since, of course, fake news, enemy of the state, insulting reporters. So whether you are a supporter or not of the president, the real demolition of that institution, the respect for the free press, even on days when you're having bad days and don't like the coverage, is very, very concerning, and something that, whether I'm still a journalist or not, it strikes right to the core of concern for me. So it's hard for me to even compare. When I was there, I had some battles, and I got some cold shoulders and all of that for coverage that they didn't necessarily think was in the most positive light, which wasn't my job. But there was a respect at the end of the day. And so I have a lot of respect for the people my colleagues who are still out there plugging away. Totally different world.
Yeah. Let's dive into some of the COVID-19 debate, right? On a daily basis, Americans debate the strategy that we as a nation have taken to respond to the pandemic. Could we have approached things differently? Should we have approached things differently? Who do you hold responsible? None of those questions am I going to ask you to weigh in on, but as a reporter, how do you begin to approach your job in a way where people can find the answers to these questions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, facts still matter. They do, right? And so when you see science experts say, hey, listen, you are less likely to catch this disease or share it if you do these basic things,
right?
And we've seen that happen, right? We've seen the trend go down as the country understood what to do. I think those things matter. And so I've always been a fan of steering people towards, well, I read this and I heard this. Don't focus on what you read and heard. Like, who are your sources? And in this case, the science and health community have really been the leaders. To some degree, there have been political leaders too, who, in my opinion, follow the health and science community. Now, there's a massive counter argument, which is the economic imperative to get people, out in jobs, and also a cultural component to get people to be able to see their families and travel. So that's a legitimate debate, but you shouldn't really be debating what's true and what's not. It's a real concern, Paul. There was the poll that came out not long ago. I think it was Pew. It said that half the people had trouble believing what they were reading and hearing. Half the country, and it just shouldn't be that way. I'm following. I'm a fairly sort of good student of the news, and I think there's a lot of incredible reporting out there, and Q&As that have been out for weeks about distancing and about masks and how you can catch it and what you have to worry about and what you don't. So I steer people to the facts and the health and science experts. And, I give a lot of faith to people to try to use their heads and just listen. If somebody is saying something, there's a difference between a judgment call about when do you open or not versus a conspiracy theory about injecting disinfectants. Like, use your head, let's trust people to do their best and figure out who they can trust.
Yeah, let's take a step back here for a second. I asked about COVID-19. You're obviously living in New York City. I think it's somewhat apropos that we started this interview a little bit after 7 o'clock, which has become a memorial every day in New York in terms of paying honor to the frontline healthcare
Right.
workers and all frontline workers in New York City. What's it been like to live in New York during these times?
Well, it's really important to have perspective about New York City. We've lost about 21,000 people to this disease. The country has had about 100,000 deaths. So New York City alone has accounted for, 1/5 of all the casualties. That's, if you took California and Texas and Florida and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio and put them all together, they've had as many deaths combined as New York City. So when people talk about hotspot, this has been a grueling place to be. Now, there have been a lot of incredible stories of spirit and positivity too. But it's been really hard to live here because, again, people live this through their own experience. So the experience of New York City is markedly different than a lot of other major American cities, let alone, suburban Illinois or someplace in the rural West or South. It's the largest city in America and everybody's on top of each other. And because of all of the downfalls of testing and awareness and social distancing practices early on, this has been a place where it's exploded. And so it's been very, very tough. I think the people who have done it well have, had or found community and found ways to cope. And of course, the good side of it, Paul, is that because it has been so acute here, people take it seriously. I mean, it is very uncommon not to see somebody wearing a mask, not to be respecting space. People here understand that they could catch it or share it and they could die. And most people know somebody who fills in one of those categories. So it's affected behavior in a smart way, at least.
How has it affected, obviously, you as a professional? How has it affected you as a parent in the city?
It's been upheaval. But I have a son who's about to turn 9, and his mom and I have worked incredibly hard, like about every parent I know, in trying to keep upheaval from affecting his daily life. We never would have thought that every day was him learning at home. All of these different social platforms where he's spending time on screens, interacting with his teachers, doing community Zoom. After the school day is done, how do you keep him occupied? How do you get fresh air? How do you run around? And so there's been the normal problem solving of parenting, and then all of these other challenges that have to do with confined space and safety and stamina. And I like to think that we're doing really well because, knock on wood, he's incredibly happy and safe, and we work out a routine. But it takes kind of an invisible toll, right? If you're injured or you lost your job, that's almost something terrible and tangible. When things are going fine, and people say, "How you doing?" You say, "Oh, I'm fine," but it's not really fine. It's like fine with an asterisk, And so we've all been kind of absorbing that and processing it and trying to find relief as we can.
Yeah. So we're about 36 minutes into our conversation, and we haven't talked about the role of social media in the media today. When you started as a White House reporter, social media was just in its infancy, right? Twitter was launched in 2006. And by the time you left the press corps, the landscape had completely changed in terms of how you break news and media coverage. Talk a little bit about that change and how that impacted your career.
Yeah, as you said, it really took over in force at the end of my White House career. And, in some ways, I definitely felt like it was generational at the time, because when President Obama started breaking news on Twitter, his White House would announce major news. I thought, that's not the place to do it. I work for the AP. We were supposed to be Twitter. We're supposed to be out with the news. And so I had to adapt to that. Now that seems quaint. And of course, so many people expect that their lives will be shaped by social media. And then of course, you've seen some backlash to that, where people sort of, when they detox and they'll say, "Hey, I've been off Twitter for a month," they always tell these great stories about how they kind of got their lives back. I think it comes back to, again, individual preference and responsibility. overall, I think it's been a win for the country and communities to connect people, especially now. You've seen some real creativity from folks connecting through social media, but also it can be a weapon, from leaders and others who don't have to be held to account for spreading things that aren't true. So it's the people who now cover the White House and other beats. They live it, and they know it,
Right.
and they've gotten used to it. And I follow a lot of their work.
So talk a little bit about, there's kind of an equity in voice when you're on social media platforms, right? Everybody has access to that platform and has access to put their own spin on messages out there. Talk a little bit about kind of how that increases the need for good journalism and that truth still make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think when you think about the decline of local news, newspapers that don't exist anymore, and people see the alternative to that being social media. I disagree with that. I think there's always going to be a need for political and policy coverage, for people that get inside the room and explain what else is happening. And social media isn't the alternative to that. It's really it becomes the vehicle for that, right? And I think you've seen more and more reporters feel free to comment and share their news, and print reporters go on TV and do panels, and then they buoy that with social media content. But that's not in lieu of the story, right? There's no news to report unless they're still doing the work in person, now by Zoom, doing phone calls. And so I'm completely comfortable with the need for journalism not declining. It's the way in which it's being told is different, and I think so far that's held up.
Well, now you're on the other side of it, right? You're
Yeah.
in an advisor capacity to corporations, to the clients that you have at Mercury. Talk a little bit about right now, kind of what's top of mind for you during these times as you advise your clients. What are you telling them should be kind of on the forefront of their marketing communications, kind of storytelling strategies?
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of things, Paul. The first is that, everybody right now is in react mode, right? Their decisions are based on what they're hearing from the president, what they're hearing from the governor. They get news alerts across their phone, and they're constantly reacting. And so the first thing I advise them is to get the hell out of react mode. It doesn't mean don't pay attention to what's being announced, but you got to change the way you think about your day and think about your companies and your employees, and reset, right? This is the reality. So get the control back. The one thing that everybody wants is control, right? Because there's a real anxiousness and unfamiliarity and almost like an indignity about the idea as Americans that we can't be free. We can't go to the grocery store, we can't take trips. And so if you're a leader of an organization, think about how you reset and get the control back. I also think a lot of people are waiting for this to be over. When this is over, then we'll do X. And
Right.
I tell people to stop waiting for it to be over, because the folks who need help and guidance aren't waiting. The world's going on. And by the way, don't assume this will ever be over in the way that we know it. Right? There's absolutely going to be a different, altered American life. So start preparing for that now. And then the last thing I tell people is, I am absolutely sure that people will remember how they were treated during this period. You mentioned 9/11, and it was a where were you moment, right? Staggering. I remember that. I remember the space shuttle, when I was a Challenger, when I was a teenager. This isn't like that. There's not that one moment. It's just gradual and spreading, and it sort of has enveloped us. And so it's not so much, where were you in? It's how were you in? How were you during this period? And who was there to help you? And who was there to reach out to you? And so I'm advising the companies and organizations I work with that don't just do en masse communication. You've got to have some empathy, and you've got to have some humility, and you got to find people and talk to them like real people, just like you and I are talking now. That's what you have to do. And come whatever, 6 months, a year from now, if they bring back the furloughed workers, they have to reinvent their company, whatever they do for a living, I think how they treated people in that first period of COVID is going to be remembered.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a real test of companies who have for years said that they are people first, right? Our people are our most important resource. And now they have the opportunity to actually show that. And so I think it's telling which companies actually meant that and which companies that was a slogan or a tagline.
And the ones that are doing it well are getting a lot of credit for it, even if what they're doing is announcing bad news, right? The leaders who really think through how they tell a story to their customers and to their clients and to their patients, really think it through, right? Everybody now is used to sending thoughts and prayers during tough times. And the first people that said that really probably had in their thoughts and in their prayers that meant something. Now it's this phrase that has lost its meaning because it's the thing that you say. Well, don't be the company or the leader that does the thing that you say, right? Actually figure out what the hell you want to say and say it with some meaning, and that'll be lasting.
Yeah. So in your work and in your current role, what do you find to be the most rewarding piece of it?
You know, I mentioned earlier that it was a real learning experience for me in a surprising way to start a second career where I was inside the room. And part of what convinced me to do it were the people who hired me said, you know, you're gonna be in a conversation and the leaders of an organization, and I primarily work with mission-driven organizations, universities and nonprofits and cancer centers. They're gonna at some point get to the conversation and say, Ben, what do you think we should do? And that's not just a communications question. It's a strategy question. It's a direction of our business question. And everything that's going to come out of my mouth next is going to be informed by my journalism career. I'm not guessing, right? Here's what I know and here's what I don't know and here's what we're going to figure out. And so largely what that manifests itself in is storytelling, right? How do you take the story of an organization that might be really good at what it does, but just isn't that good at this, right? Who are you? What do you do? Why does it matter? How are you different? You know, and it's been really consistent in my work that a lot of places can't do that. They do it for a living in their work, but they can't articulate that. And so it's been fulfilling for me to help get them there, and they come out on the other side feeling really empowered. And all of a sudden, their body language changes, and they start, succeeding more. They recruit better, and they conduct their business better, and they do their fundraising better because now they understand how to tell the story of themselves. And so I've enjoyed that a lot, right? Helping them get their voice.
So let's turn to some lighter topics.
Sure.
You've recently published an article in the USA Today titled "During This Time of Pandemic Fear, I See Baseball Through My Son's Eyes."
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how baseball has helped you and your son cope with the current pandemic.
Well, you know, my son Sam has tried, all the different sports now. And a couple of years ago, he played baseball dutifully on weekend days, but we weren't really sure if he liked it. And this spring, just as that pandemic really hit in March and became part of the American consciousness, everything was shut down and his spring baseball league went away. But that was the exact moment where he really fell in love with baseball and got incredibly good at it. And so we spend some of our time during the week. I take breaks. I catch him when his school day is done, and we'll play catch up here in Brooklyn's Prospect Park, wherever we can find, a green patch. I bought a pack of 20 wiffle balls and I throw him everything I can, and he's whacking them all over the place, and he loves it. And he brings a sense of confidence and joy. And so he starts his days thinking, when do we get to do that again? Tell me another story about what it was like when you were a kid. We talk about the Yankees because we're both Yankees fans, and we talk about players. And all of a sudden, he's got this energy to him that has lifted him and lifted us. And I'm always going to remember this period, as I wrote in that piece, for what it gave, not just what it took, because he's given me something, right? He's given me something to look forward to, and he's kind of risen above. He's got to wear a mask when he walks around, but he's not focused on that. He's focused on spending time with his parents and playing baseball and having fun. And I love that about him.
Absolutely. Baseball has been a topic of interest for you. I remember reading an interesting story about how you tracked down George Bush when he was president to talk about baseball. As we know, he was owner of the Texas Rangers, so
yeah,
baseball has been a big part of his life. Talk a bit about the chase to get that story and then the actual story that you wrote.
Yeah, well, when I covered the White House in the first year, I had the joy of being the Sunday through Thursday reporter. And so I would go into the West Wing and check around. And President Bush at the end of his tenure. This was during, the Iraq War, and he just stayed at home, didn't venture out anymore. And I always wondered, how is he spending his time? I'm here, I might as well find out. And so the communications director at the time, a very good guy, Kevin Sullivan, said, well, he spends a lot of time, with baseball on in the background. So whether he's reading or exercising or in between phone calls, he just likes it as background noise. And he said, well, great idea if you could see that. I'm like, yes, so let's see that. And we talked about different ways to do it as a feature story. And it just never happened. But one day that he came to me, Kevin Sullivan did, and said, the president and I spoke about the idea on the flight back on Marine One. So the Marine One, the president's helicopter, would come back from Andrews Air Force Base and fly through the mall and then land on the South Lawn. It's a very dramatic thing. And I said, you guys were talking about me, about baseball on the flight back? He said, yeah. I'm like, what did he want to know? He's like, well, he wanted to know, he wasn't concerned about the direction of the story, whether we were at this time. He wanted to be sure that I actually understood the sport to the level that he did and could explain the infield fly rule and certain strategy. And so, once I passed that test, then it was just down to opportunity. And I was covering the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, and Dana Perino was the press secretary, and she was aware of all this and said, all right, Ben, do that thing that you've been talking about. Come on, let's do it right now. It was sort of a spontaneous decision. So I went over and sat next to him. We talked about baseball. We talked about sports, the importance of being there and rooting for American athletes, and the kind of peace it gives them. It was a very fun moment.
So did you ever think in your wildest dreams that you would be talking to the President of the United States at the Olympics in China about baseball? I mean, just kind of wrap your mind around that for a second.
No, and look, those things kind of kept happening, and I felt the best way I could wrap my mind around it was not to sort of overly reflect on it. I mean, I would enjoy it, but then we were back on the plane, and we were back to hard news, and so those are great memories, but you wouldn't really sort of have any time to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe where my life is going. Now, somebody else, if they hadn't seen me in a while, said, I can't believe that, kind of like you did. And I would love that, because it would shake me out of the daily news and the work mode and say, you know what, that actually was pretty cool. It was hard to appreciate it all in the moment. Although that one, yeah, I looked around, I'm like, okay, and we're watching the U.S.-China baseball game in Olympics, and I'm interviewing the president about the sport I love. That was a good story.
So we talked about Penn State when you were a student and how Penn State positioned you for your career, which has certainly been a career of impact. But now talk about your Penn State experience as an alumnus, about getting back to State College, and about the interactions that you've been able to have with the college and with students. Talk about what that has meant to you.
Yeah, I mean, I really try to stay connected to Penn State. And like a lot of alums do, part of it is a sense of course, giving back and helping students where I can, or, joining panels of discussions, doing interviews like this. But it's not just about giving. I get a lot out of it too. I think Penn State is so prolific and so big that it can be hard for alumni to know what the options are. And I feel like I brought that up at a series of, events over the last, say, 10 years. And it's gotten better and better and better, where now there are emails that say, if you want to participate, here are your options. If you want to give into COVID, here's how you could give your time and your money. So I think it's been really rewarding. I mean, we all get busy. And so sometimes it's not a straight line, like it's up and down. There could be a few different events and then you don't feel as connected. But I've really tried to make it a priority, because not just what I can give, which is hopefully something, right? But it's also what I get out of it. And as you said at the beginning, that's also my hometown, right? So you always want to have a sense of community.
Absolutely. So we have time for just a couple more questions. I see some questions have come in. And like I said, we have some recent graduates and some students that are listening in. So what advice would you give a recent journalist grad about how to distinguish themselves in the job market, and especially kind of specific to the current job market?
Sure. And by the way, I'm probably going to have a cameo here from my son, who's been patiently waiting. I think he heard me talking about him in baseball. So there he is. There's the slugger in the family. Listen, I would say the main thing is in this market, to stay positive, right? Stay positive. Don't think about it so incrementally as whether you got the interview, whether you got the internship. Focus on what you're doing to prepare for every interview. We just had a call at my company today with interns for the summer, and it wasn't clear we were even going to have a summer internship program this year, but we did. And so the partners at the firm in our New York office spoke with them, and one of the interns was basically almost jumping through the screen to say, I'm so happy to be here. I want to learn from you. I want to be helpful. Here's where I live. That's what I do. And you could just tell, right, that there was a passion there. And that's probably how that guy got the internship, and it's going to pay off for him. So control what you can control. Stay positive. Don't go outside yourself to be distinctive. Be yourself, but just do it really, really well, right? And put yourself out there.
Awesome. So you mentioned Sam is in the background. Certainly, Penn State is a family affair for so many Penn Staters. One of my most memorable moments was when you received the Alumni Fellow Award, and your son got up on stage with you and was part of the acceptance speech. And so I'm wondering if we might bring him in for a cameo right now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, come on in, buddy. Yeah, so I had like 15 minutes of fame there, and I had this great idea to surprise everybody and include him. And then he did so well, I was like, oh, that kid took my 15 minutes of fame, but it was great fun. He's such an adventurer, and we did the We Are, hang on. We did the We Are Penn State chant, and, I'm working on him. He's still got some years to decide, but I think are we tilting this towards Penn State for you? Okay. Yeah, he's thinking.
Let's see if he remembers it. Sam, we are
Penn State.
All right. That's fantastic. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. That's all the time that we have this evening. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and also want to thank everybody who's tuned in on Zoom and on Facebook Live. As a reminder, we'll be hosting additional speaker sessions in the coming weeks, and this programming in addition to a wide array of online networking events and career programs that are available throughout the year. Again, find the full listing on our website at alumni.psu.edu. Thanks again, and we are
Penn State. Thanks, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.